Hi there. Lately, I've seen an awful lot of people come on and talk about the world situation today and so on. Some of whom are well informed, some of whom not so much so. Some of whom are taking it all in stride, some are struggling. Um, I'm not going to talk about the current situation with the COVID-19 virus. Because seriously, my amount of knowledge in that particular area is extremely limited. So instead, I'm going to stick with what I always speak about, and that is photography. I've been asked to do a couple of presentations for the local camera club because, given the fact that we can no longer hold actual meetings with people in a room, what we've had to do, of course, is to go online and use one of the online meeting systems to run a meeting. Now, of course, metering modes is something that anybody who is very familiar with their camera have probably experimented with, but an awful lot of people have sort of shied away from. Mainly because the different modes will give you different results if you don't take into account the different way in which they work. For instance, if you're using the evaluative metering or matrix metering or multi-segment metering or whatever it happens to be called by your particular camera company, if you're using that system, then what you will find is that it will give you a reasonably good exposure most of the time. But there are places where it cannot get it right. It struggles. When that happens, we have other options. For instance, center-weighted metering works quite well if your main subject is reasonably centered in your image and the image is relatively evenly lit. That's not the only place where that works. I mean, for years, I shot with a Pentax K1000, and all it had was an averaging system. That's it. So I learned how to adapt to that, and I got pretty good exposures most of the time. So it is a very valuable aid. Some people will say, turn off evaluative metering and use that all the time. And their reasoning is simple. That is a predictable result. Once you learn how that works, you get predictable results. Matrix metering, remember what it's doing actually is looking at the scene. It's looking at the brightness in the scene. It's looking at where the brightness is spread out in the scene. And then it's comparing it to a bunch of possible scenarios that are stored in its memory. When it finds a scenario that roughly matches your meter reading, it will set the camera to that particular setting. Now, that's fine, provided, of course, it is something that fits one of those patterns. If not, you have a problem. While center-weighted metering, once you've learned how to use it, it is pretty predictable. Now, I'm not suggesting we use center-weighted metering. Most of the time, I use evaluative metering, to be honest. Moving on, we get into even more specific types. Canon has something that they call, I can't remember what they call it right off, but basically it is metering a fairly large area of the center and ignoring the outside altogether. It's not quite spot metering, but it's a small area metering. It also can be very useful in many different types of situations, but since it seems to be specific to Canon, let's move on. If you are a Canon user, by the way, that doesn't mean I'm ignoring you. It just means you're going to have to read your manual because that's something that the others don't really have. Just like we're going to get to something later that the others don't really have. Moving on, we get spot metering. Now, spot metering it's the trickiest, but probably the most accurate way to meter in many situations. The thing about spot metering is that you choose where you're going to meter from. You choose something that is as close to a neutral 18% gray in terms of tone, not color, but tone, You pick an area in your image that's as close to that as you can, you meter off that, you set your exposure based on that, and you will get a reasonably accurate exposure. In some situations it's fantastic, like for instance in heavily backlit situations it works extremely well. The issue with it is that, of course, as soon as you point the camera at something else, the meter is going to give you a totally different reading. So it is really a case of get the exposure you need, lock it in, take the picture, move on. And if you are going to meter off something else, don't forget you're on spot metering. Don't forget you have to meter in the right place. It will slow you down. Nikon and Olympus, I'm not sure who else, but Nikon and Olympus now, Nikon in many of their cameras, their newer cameras, and Olympus in pretty much all of their Micro Four Thirds cameras, have something that they call, well, basically it's highlight spot metering, where you meter off a highlight, and it will properly expose that highlight, and everything else will fall wherever it may. So if you're looking at a scene where the highlights are extremely important and you want to make sure you don't burn them out and you get them just right, you can put it in this highlight spot metering mode, spot meter off where your whites should be, and get a good exposure. I'm not sure about anybody else, but Olympus at least has added another mode, the spot metering on shadow, where you put your spot meter on the darkest part of your image, the part that you don't mind going to black, and it will meter off that and will set the exposure accordingly. If you need strong shadows, if you need deep blacks, that method works quite well. Anyhow, guys, that's a quick rundown of the major metering modes. Now, you might have heard me mention earlier about 18% gray. Please remember one thing about all light meters, and that is that they are merely looking for a level of light. And that level of light will be basically a neutral gray, an 18% gray. If you've got a gray card, or if you've seen a gray card, you'll know what I'm talking about. That neutral gray is right in the middle of the brightness scale. It is right in the middle between bright white and black. So that medium, that middle point, is what the camera is always going to be looking for. It's what the light meter is always looking for. So all of these sophisticated matrix metering and evaluative metering schemes, basically what they're doing is looking at all the different brightnesses all around and deciding what it's going to be. So if it's me in the picture, then it will probably notice that the background is maybe all bright. Then there's a darker object right in the center. That darker object in the center is probably where we should put the greatest weight. So it weights the exposure to make this as well exposed as possible. And if this blows out, so be it. That's the way evaluative metering works. So if it's not this you wanted, if it's that, then of course it'll probably mess up. So that's why the other systems are there. Anyhow, guys, this I know is a very rudimentary, very quick, not terribly informative run through what metering modes are all about, but hopefully it will give you something that will allow you a jumping off point where you can learn more about it. Read your manual. That's the most important thing. Look at the modes that are in your camera, usually in the menu somewhere. You will see all these different modes. Figure out which ones your camera has and go with it. Anyhow, if you've enjoyed this video, please give me a like. If you'd like to see more of my videos, then subscribe to this channel. And of course, if you think anybody can get anything useful about this particular video, then share it. Bye for now.